Welcome to a new episode of Oxford Policy Pod. In today's episode, we have a very special guest to discuss monetary and fiscal policy in Paraguay, my home country. But first, I would like to say how happy I am to be here with you, Billy, having this interesting conversation about how economics is intertwined with the design and evaluation of public policy.
Thanks, Cecilia. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Carlos Fernandez, Paraguay's Minister of Economy and Finance and former Governor of the Central Bank. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and has served as senior economist at the IMF, country economist at the World Bank, and was named Finance Minister of the Year Americas by The Banker in 2025. In 2026, he will chair the IMF World Bank annual meetings. Minister, welcome to Oxford.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, Minister, it is a pleasure to have you here with us today. You have led the two most important economic institutions in Paraguay, the Central Bank and now the Ministry of Economy and Finance. So, let me start with something lighter. People often say that the architecture of University of Chicago has some similarities with Oxford. So, this makes you feel at home already.
That's for sure. The second I left the train, because we came by train from London, and I started seeing the building and so on, I felt at home. Really reminds me the University of Chicago. I'm very pleased to be here, and I have the luxury to teach at the university, to taught at the University of Chicago, not anymore, because I assume as the Minister of Finance in Paraguay. But who knows? Maybe I'm going to be lucky enough to start teaching also here at Oxford.
Thank you very much. For those in our audience who might not be familiar with Paraguay, who you describe the country's current economic landscape? And can you share how your career transition from the central bank governor to the Minister of Economy had shaped your approach to these policies?
First, the moment is incredible. Probably is one of, since democracy that started in '89 is the best situation for the country on economic terms for Paraguay. We just as a summary, we got 2 investment grade ratings according to Moody's and also Standard and Poor's. So probably it's the best situation since democracy in Paraguay. Now, talking about transitioning from the central bank government to Minister of Finance, let me tell you the following. I miss the central bank. Even though they complement each other, the degree of this responsibility is different. The topics you're touching being Minister of Economy is much wider than when you are a government of the central bank or governor of the central bank. But both of them are quite important. You mentioned very well that both of them are the main legs of all the macroeconomic stabilities that we're enjoying at this moment in Paraguay, but they're quite different. For me, it was important to be first governor of the central bank because at the time, I got a lot of engagement with the Minister of Finance. We worked closely together. So for me, it was not a surprise what I found at the Minister of Finance at the time. We changed the minister, just for the people, we changed the Minister of Finance to become Minister of Economy and Finance. It was one of the first reforms we passed. But again, transitioning was easier because I was working very closely with the former ministry, and that helps you to understand and what you're going to find at the other institution in Paraguay.
Wonderful. And Minister, let's talk a little bit more about that transition. It's from my understanding from the previous session that you've passed 22 laws since belonging to this government. Is there one of these laws that particularly was at the top of your agenda in this transition?
Probably a lot of them. We were very, the first reform we passed was regarding the tax revenue office. There were 2, we combined into 1. The second one we passed was the conversion of the Ministry of Finance into the Ministry of Economy and Finance. So I can mention the two of them because those were the first two that we passed. The others one were as important as these two, but were more challenging because that implies affecting many people. Let me tell you one of them, the superintendency of pension reform, because there are many pension funds in Paraguay that were unregulated. And of course, there are many pensioners. So when you're passing a law regarding something about pension is affecting the pensioners, that was more challenging to pass. But anyway, was within the first reforms that we passed. Many of them were, all of them were crucial. And we want to be remembered of the government of reforms. We have to be remembered by something. As I mentioned during the talk that we had before, this is a never-ending story. There is always way to improve the governance of your country, and you have to work on that with the reforms.
Yeah, so in that sense, another reform that you have led is the civil service reform.
Exactly.
So it's often this one described as the most like difficult reform in any country, economically necessary but political sensitive. So what is the main obstacle to professionalizing the Paraguayan public sector today?
Um, the law is quite important. I don't know if that was the most difficult. The superintendency of pension reform is quite important, and right now we are in the middle of another reform that is regarding the pension for the public sector employees. That is quite challenging. We were already past the lower house, so we need to go to Senate. So let's see what happens in March. But anyway, all of them are difficult because affects many people and affect directly. All the reforms affect the people, but directly, this is quite challenging. But the way we solve the reforms, especially to the colleagues working, to the public servants, was okay. Look at the central banks, and you are from the central bank. Look at the central bank; it's very professional. You don't have to go on a strike, or you don't have to go into a demonstration at the end of, or at the beginning of, at the end of every years when the Congress is discussing the budget. Why? Because you have the career. So you know that if you do the right thing, you can really start earning more and more salaries because there is a career. So the way to sell is to give an example of there is a future where I can be better off if I do the right thing. And that's the way how we solve this public servant reform that we did in Paraguay. Just putting the central bank as an example. And in Paraguay, you guys are the ones being paid the most. And everyone, of course, respect the work of the central bank, the career at the central bank, and everyone wants to have the same type of career. That's the way how we solve.
I'm interested, Minister. In our last session, you had a fantastic quote on it's not so much about what you do, but perhaps how you do it.
Mhm.
And there you're discussing a lot about understanding incentives, which is something that even in our MPP economics program, we were really learning about how to understand incentives. Can you tell us another example maybe where you've had to have a deeper understanding of what might incentivize a stakeholder that you've been working with?
Even well, there are so many examples. I mean, when you're talking, because we were talking about how to deal with politicians, but remember also that sometimes you have to convince your colleagues of the cabinet also that okay, this is going to be good for you. Also, you need to really support this idea, and so my point there was. Theoretically, you can know what to do, but the problem is to implement the policy that you really believe is the right thing to do. Given that the policy or public policy affects the people, you really have to to really convince them. And the way to convince them is for them, because they do have a utility function where they probably their own benefit is the most important variable in the utility function of the people. You have to convince them, well, this is the way how you're going to benefit from this reform or these policies and so on. So you have to show a lot of empathy on other people, because they have different ideas, different views, different interests of what you have. And you have to work with that. Makes your life easier if you understand the other side of the table. And that is exactly what I usually mention also when you're working with the private sector. The private sector, because I work at the private sector also, it's interesting. I was there before, and right now I'm here. But I don't forget when I was there. With multilaterals, the same. I know what they want. And with all the stakeholders in any reforms, in any policy, always try to be in the other side of the table. That makes your decision better.
So, in that sense, how do you measure whatever an institutional reform is actually working?
There reforms, you do have some reforms that are good for the short term, and some reforms that you're not going to see any results in the short term. They are going to be good in the middle term. Clearly, the reforms that are useful in Paraguay right now in the short term is the merging of the two tax revenue agencies, because we're able to increase the tax pressure from 10% of GDP to 11.2% of GDP. So it's 1.2% more. So you also see the impact of the reform in my own ministry, that is the Ministry of Economy. Now we do have a different role. We are not only the cashier taking the money and paying. We are thinking about medium-term strategy of the country. We launched, for example, a national development plan that is making some goals for until 2050. So I'm not going to be there for sure by 2050. But we were able to really change the view that the Minister of Finance is just Minister of Finance, just getting the taxes and paying. Now we have a Minister of Economy that is thinking about medium-term development of the country. So those two things, you are seeing results right away. Others, you're going to see in the future. I mean, this superintendency of pension, you're going to see in the future. The public servant for the central bank took a long time in order to really deliver a professional public servant at the central bank. So the same will happen with that reform. So you have to be aware that you have to think on the next generation, not only on the next election when you're doing the reforms.
Speaking of those reforms that are perhaps a little bit more challenging to implement, in our last session, you recalled instances in both healthcare and education specifically, where perhaps a little bit more challenging to see those results immediately, and they are that sort of long-term investment in human capital. How do you make sure that a population really understands the direction you're taking those areas?
Yeah, even though some results you can see right away, in the sense that we are building many regional hospital, because the health service was very concentrated in Asunción. Now we're building some hospital in different part of the country, so that the people doesn't need to go to Asunción in order to get the proper health service for them. Some of the action that we're taking, you're going to see right away, but in the sense of building a better human capital for the whole population, it's going to take more time. But it's the right thing to do. Sometimes you have to take the right thing to do instead of just the most popular thing to do, because some policies are not the most popular things and to do. They're painful, but it's the right thing to do. This reform of the pension system for public servants is the right thing to do. It's going to be painful, because actually implies decreasing some pension benefits that are very generous in some schemes in Paraguay. But it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, it's unsustainable. So you mentioned something that is quite important: communication. Communication of public policies is quite important. Um, you you have to have the right amount of public exposure in the media, but you have to be there. You cannot be only in your office, in closed door and so on. You have to go and open, explain to people, and to people you can explain directly. That is a good way to do it, but you have to use the media also in order to explain what are you doing.
In that sense, what helps you, Minister, to manage that political pressures that comes with the role that you have?
Um, After you finish your PhD in Chicago, there's no pressure that can kill you really. um, now, yes, I mean you have to develop the quality to really face all the pressure you have, because well, Minister of Economy and Finance is still quite powerful in the sense that it's assigning the resources, and there are limited resources for infinite needs, and it's impossible to really serve to all. But one thing that I mentioned in the session is sometimes politicians needs just an answer. I mean, but answer them. I mean, don't hide from them. They need an answer. Say yes or no. Cannot be always no. Cannot be always yes. But you can combine the yes and no. But you need to really also to communicate with them, because they are the one finally taking the decisions, important economic decision, because all the reforms pass by Congress, all the budget passed by Congress. Therefore, you really have to build trust and relation with Congress. It's important if you're a policymaker.
Minister, you speak and you have spoken all morning with a really a sense of hope and pragmatism in your line of work. Is there a geopolitical trend or something happening in the broader economic landscape that concerns you most?
At the war, um, it's not a very easy time in the war. It's very volatile, but I'm very optimistic always. And you have to be very pragmatic also there. Um, there are things that you can influence. For being Paraguay very small and open, is subject to volatility from the war, where Paraguay have zero influence probably. And you have to prepare for that and continue to work, continue to do the right thing. Those are preconditions for you, and you have to work with that volatility. I would love to see a more integrated war in the sense of trade and so on, but given that at this moment is more fragmented, uh, we continue to work. If you cannot, I always say, if you cannot trade north to south, and I'm not saying, I was saying this in the sense of the recent agreement, European Union, Mercosur, well, start working south to south, start trading south to south. So you need to adapt. I always remember Darwin, who always said it's not the species that is the strongest that survives over time. It's the one who adapt the most to the new conditions who will survive. Therefore, as economies in the world, we need to adapt to new conditions. Those are going to be the most successful economies in the world going forward.
So, Paraguay recently achieved investment grade status. Beyond the symbolic recognition, what concrete implications does this have for our country's development?
It's quite important. It is true that Paraguay was doing good things at the macro level. The numbers are basically the same: pre-investment grade and post-investment grade. Those are good numbers, but it's always good to see this recognition by credit rating agency open the door for the people to really start more closely. They heard about Paraguay before, but right now they are hearing, and also they're studying Paraguay. So it's going to be important. what I always mention also in Paraguay regarding investment grade, it's not the public sector who will benefit the most. Because if you look at the quote of our sovereign bonds in the international markets, basically we were investment grade before the credit rating agencies granted investment grade. But the sector that can benefit the most is the private sector, because right now a lot of people we want to invest in Paraguay, and a lot of people we will be able to invest in Paraguay. They will be looking for partnership with Paraguayan enterprises. They will be looking in order to lend to Paraguayan firms or companies. They will be willing to really buy some shares of Paraguayan companies. So, in, if we are successful or not to really take advantage of the investment grade status will depend a lot on the private sector. And we are working with them, showing what they can do at this moment in order to enjoy the benefit of being investment grade.
Wonderful. Look, as we draw to a close, Minister, I'd love for you to share some of your wisdom with our MPP colleagues. As you know, we have almost 150 of us. Many are aspiring policymakers like yourself and have left this morning's session and hopefully this podcast feeling a little bit more inspired and hopeful. Do you have any formative experiences that you experienced throughout your 20s or 30s that really shaped the way your career went and led you to this position now?
Your career will never be perfect. You're going to fall many times. You're going to make mistakes many times. But what is important is not how many times you fall, it's how many times you get up after the falling. That is important, how you correct the mistake. One thing I learned at the central bank at the beginning, because I was new at the central bank, probably was the second week. And I was in charge of making a table, simple table, but the table went usually to the central bank governor at the time. And the central bank governor at the time used to be the chief economist. So he knew very well about the table, how the numbers over there should have a dynamic, and he knows when something is wrong. And I did it, and I did it wrong. And I remember my boss, my first boss said, only the people who work make mistake. If you don't work, you're not going to make any mistake. So get ready for that.
Wonderful advice.
So my last question for you is, how important do you think is the exposure to global best practices like studying abroad, whether it could be this, yes, through study or professional experience? And what responsibilities come with applying that knowledge back home?
It's extremely important, really. Always at the private sector and the public sector. Why? Because you engage at the MPP or working at the World Bank or at the IMF. You really engage with people who has different experience, and maybe in the future you're going to face one problem, one economic problem, and you're going to remember, okay, I remember this guy had the same problem in his country, and they solved the following way. I do remember, for example, when I was working at the IMF, and the mission chief for Romania actually built up the same team that negotiated with Paraguay the standby agreement. I was on the other side of the table at the time because I was the chief economy, but all the other members of the mission were the same people who negotiated with Paraguay in the standby agreement. At the time, Romania was negotiating with the IMF in a standby agreement. So for us, it was very easy because when we were discussing what to do, what not to do, and what was the experience for fiscal adjustment or for monetary policy, we were discussing, remember in Paraguay we did this, remember in Paraguay this we passed this law, remember in Paraguay. So the fact that you engage with people with different nationalities and so on, open really your brain in different ways. to solve the problems, to really try to help you to do the best policy for your country, but also important. I mean, remember, guys, you're going to be together here for 1 year, no? 150. But actually, you're not going to be together for 1 year. You're going to be together forever. It's incredible the link that you're going to develop forever right now. And that is going to be important in your career. The link that you're really building at this moment of offer.
Speaking about opening your mind, I have one final question before I hand over to Cecilia to close. And that is, have you got one book or one film that has really opened your mind as a thinker, as a policymaker?
No, difficult to say only one. I mean, you're learning like every day, every book, every experience, every paper, every news. I mean, sometimes you get a lot of food for thought only by reading news. It's difficult to say only one. Of course, for my career, for me, the important clearly was getting the PhD at the University of Chicago. For me, was an incredible experience. Developed many skills, including the fact of how to handle pressures, because really, if you survive University of Chicago, you can survive anything. Really. But yeah, that was for me the stamp of my career, the University of Chicago. But continue, as I mentioned the session, including reform. This is a never-ending story. I mean, you cannot stop it. I mean, not because I finished the PhD at the University of Chicago and say I know everything. No, you have to continue to work. You're learning. You're specializing. And you're building the career and the person you are also. I mean, not only professionally, but also personally, because I mentioned also, one thing is academics. Another thing is when you're dealing as a policymaker with people. It's important both, but it's a different word and you need to complement both.
My final question it is, if we revisit this conversation in 20 years, what would you hope people say about this period of economics reform in Paraguay?
Remember that I mentioned in the session that what is important for you as a leader in an institution is that when you're leaving power, you can go back to that institution and everyone will greet you, will say hello, will be happy that you're back. So in 20 years, I'm gonna be happy to really be remembered as a person who, thanks to the president, was leading all the reforms of Paraguay. Not because of the reform, because the reforms allow the people of Paraguay to be better off. Public policies without any effects on the people are worthless. We do policies because we care about the people.
Excellent.
Minister, we are so grateful to have had you in this conversation. As it sort of went on, I felt that it was a nice, natural conversation. And yeah, it was lovely to get that sort of first-person insight from you beyond just the news headlines and the media that you do elsewhere. So thank you for your time.
This was such a great conversation. Thank you for your openness, and we hope to see you again.
Yeah, hopefully, yes. I'm always happy to be here.
Thank
Excellent.
you.